so much.
Doesn't matter. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome. I might just firstly outline earlier on what happened in the week, just into the lead-up of today's and last night's European Council. I travelled to Luxembourg to meet with European Affairs and Foreign Affairs Ministers for the General Affairs Committee to prepare for this current Council, but also to discuss a number of different issues. Firstly, and feeding into the conclusions for today, we discussed migration, external relations and security within the EU. In terms of migration, just to focus on one, we particularly welcome the focus on addressing the root causes, and while the relationship with Africa is clearly more than migration, I particularly welcomed the positive language on developing an EU-Africa cooperation at a much higher level, and something that we support. In terms of security of the EU, the main focus was around cybersecurity and disinformation, in particular building stronger cybersecurity, having a whole of society approach, and then raising public awareness around disinformation. The lunchtime discussion with Commissioner Oettinger very much focused on the next MFF. We and I outlined the Irish position, very much our support for the priorities outlined by the Commission, but again expressed our concern that the main traditional priorities like CAP and cohesion were being cut, and obviously the significance and the importance to ensure the European added value. There was an afternoon discussion focused on the rule of law, but prior to that, myself and the Taoiseach met with Michel Barnier, who gave us a current state of play on Brexit negotiations before he addressed the EU27 Article 50 Committee. And I think, again, and the Taoiseach can outline the discussion last night, but I think what was very clear at the General Affairs as well, there was disappointment. The support for Michel Barnier as chief negotiator is strong, the unity of the 27 is strong, and support for Ireland and the Irish issue is steadfast. So I'll pass over to the Taoiseach.
Thanks very much. I'll run through this quite briefly so we can save the time for questions, but just to let you know, there are several summits happening over the next couple of days. As you know, there's the Article 50 summit on Brexit, which happened last night, the European Council regular meeting, which focused on migration, internal security and external relations, which happened this morning, the Euro Summit, which happened over lunch, and we'll be heading into the EU-Asia Summit, which happens tonight and runs through tomorrow. I'm also taking the opportunity to have bilaterals, sit-down bilaterals with Prime Minister May, Antonio Tajani, who's President of the European Parliament. We'll also be having bilaterals with the President of Mongolia, Prime Minister of Norway, and the Deputy Prime Minister of Malaysia later on, who is a graduate of RTSI in Dublin, as some of you will know, and obviously spoke to lots of my counterparts over lunch, over dinner, and on Marge, and that'll continue through today and tomorrow. On Brexit, I think it's fair to say that the negotiators working away behind the scenes have made some progress in the last couple of weeks, but certainly not the level of progress that we could describe as decisive progress, which is what we hoped would be possible by the summit. There are still big gaps. Lots of things are agreed, but there are still big gaps, both in terms of the shape of the future relationship and also the protocol on Northern Ireland and Ireland, also known as the backstop. Having discussed the issue last night in Article 50 format, we as the EU27 agreed 5 things. We agreed that we would reaffirm support and confidence in Michel Barnier and the task force to bring forward the negotiations, that we would maintain EU unity among the 27 member states and the institutions, that not enough progress had been made so far. We called on the TF50, on the task force, to intensify their work in the weeks ahead, and also we decided not to make a decision on whether or not there should be a summit in November. There is a summit scheduled already for December, as you know, so we left it in the hands of Michel Barnier to recommend to President Tusk as to whether or not there should be a summit in November. So we're not going to the summit for the sake of having a summit. If we're having a summit, it'll be either to finalise and sign off on a withdrawal agreement, or it'll be because talks have broken down and we need to meet to intensify preparations for a no-deal scenario. So obviously very much working towards the former rather than the latter. In terms of the summit on migration, again, a detailed discussion on illegal migration and how that's affecting Europe. Committed once again to strengthen our external borders, and that's very much happening. In cooperating with source countries and transit countries, particularly in Africa, and also once again spoke about the need for solidarity and flexible solidarity among member states. We adopted the conclusions on internal security and also on external relations, and agreed that we would hold an EU Arab League summit in February to build relations between the European Union on the one hand and the Arab League on the other. So that'll be held in Egypt towards the end of February. We discussed the Khashoggi case, as you can imagine, and shared the view that there should be an independent investigation into what transpired in Istanbul. There was a lot of concern about that and some of the information that's been coming out of Istanbul in that regard, and how it could impact very seriously on relations with Saudi Arabia if what's alleged to have happened has happened. And we strongly believe there should be an independent investigation into that case. There was discussion on the elections in Bosnia-Herzegovina, discussions on Venezuela, where it was agreed to set up a contact group to exert political pressure on the regime in Venezuela to restore democracy and human rights and freedoms. I mentioned the EU Arab League summit already. In terms of the Eurozone summit, which happened over lunch, a good discussion with the President of the Eurogroup and the President of the ECB there about the reform of the Eurozone and the need to complete economic and monetary union, focusing on the capital markets union, on a banking union, on developing a European deposit insurance scheme to guarantee the savings of European citizens across the European Union, and also the possibility of developing a Eurozone fiscal capacity. I took the opportunity from Ireland's side just to inform everyone there that we had collected all of the money that the European Commission argues that Apple owes. That is all now collected. It's in an escrow account and will stay there until the European courts determine where that money should go. And as you'll have heard, the Commission has now dropped its infringement proceedings on Ireland with regard to the collection of those monies. I also took the opportunity as well to inform the Council that Ireland passed a budget last week which will balance the books. We'll have no deficit for the first time in 10 years, and also that we introduced an exit tax, which is part of the efforts that we're making as a country to crack down on tax avoidance by large corporations. So having introduced an exit tax just last week, that complements things we've done already to eliminate loopholes such as the double Irish, such as stateless corporations and so on. So it's an opportunity just to lay out to our European partners all that we're doing in that space to cooperate with tax transparency and ensure that large companies pay the tax that they owe in full where they owe it. And that was very well received.
Thanks very much, Taoiseach and Minister. We've limited time for questions today, but we'll get to as many as we can. We'll kick off with Pat Leahy from the Irish Times.
Taoiseach, was there any discussion or can you give us an insight into the thinking around the table on the difficulties that Mrs May faces in London? I mean, you're all politicians. It seems strange that you don't take account of the political context that she faces. And secondly, and apologies to my colleagues for the appallingly self-referential nature of this question, but when you produced the copy of the Irish Times with the story about the terrible atrocity that took place at the customs post, what was the reaction around the table?
I suppose take the first question first. The Article 50 meeting probably took less long than most people anticipated in many ways because we've had so many discussions about Brexit already. A lot of Prime Ministers didn't intervene. There were 11 interventions altogether. So everyone didn't feel the need to make further intervention on Brexit. Yes, there absolutely is an acknowledgement across the European Union. We're all politicians and we do understand that Prime Minister May has to get a deal that she's able to get through Westminster. And we know how divided British politics is at the moment, not just the government and the governing party, but also the Parliament itself. So we're very aware of the enormous challenge the Prime Minister May faces in getting an agreement through Westminster, and we want to help her with that. But we also have to bear in mind the other side of that equation. Any agreement also has to be ratified by the European Parliament, and we shouldn't forget the role of the European Parliament in this. And the European Parliament is not and should not approve a deal that undermines the single market, undermines the customs union, and doesn't give Ireland what we need in relation to a backstop. So that has to be borne in mind as well. And we're also running into European elections too, and there will be European elections in May, and that has to be borne in mind as well. We don't want to give any encouragement to Eurosceptic or populist forces either. in the run into those elections. So whilst we fully appreciate the political difficulties and divisions that exist in the UK, it also has to be appreciated that the European Parliament has a role too, and that there are political considerations across the continent as well. In relation to using the front page of the Irish Times, I sort of read that on the way over, and I just thought it was a useful prop really to demonstrate to all of the European leaders the extent to which the concerns about the re-emergence of a hard border and the possibility of a return to violence are very real. You know, this was a front page of an Irish newspaper published yesterday, interviewing family members, the daughter of somebody who was killed at a customs post on the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland back in the 1970s. And that is what used to happen when we had customs posts in Ireland. And I just wanted to make sure that there was no sense in the room that in any way anybody in Ireland or in the Irish government was anyhow exaggerating the real risk of a return to violence in Ireland. And I pointed out as well that we've gone now for nearly 2 years without a functioning executive and assembly in Northern Ireland. The two major parties representing the two communities in Northern Ireland have been unable to come together to form a coalition government, which they had been able to do for most of the last 20 years. And I met the leaders of both of the two main parties last week, and they were in full agreement that the uncertainty around Brexit was one of the major reasons why they haven't been able to form an executive, form a power-sharing coalition. So we can see that the uncertainty about Brexit is already having an effect. If we were to have a hard Brexit, imagine the effects that could potentially follow.
Sean, the final from Newstalk, followed by Gabrielle from Reuters and Tony from RT.
Taoiseach, in your meeting with Theresa May yesterday, did she express any possibility or rollback on the demand for a time-limited backstop, or maybe any openness to not having that time limit on it? And you kind of suggested that there might be, instead of a time limit, a sort of an agreed endpoint to it. Could you give us a bit more of an idea of what you're thinking what that endpoint might be if it's not a specific time?
Yeah, I think we're actually in broad agreement on that. Bear in mind the paper that was published jointly by the EU and the UK back in March said that the backstop would have to be, one, legally operative, would have to work, and two, it would have to apply unless and until there's a new agreement between the EU and the UK which would supersede it and therefore render it unnecessary. And I was very reassured that Prime Minister May didn't attempt in any way to row back from those commitments which the UK made in writing back in March. So what we all agree when it comes to the backstop on Ireland and Northern Ireland is that, one, we never want to have to invoke it because we want to spend the transition period, the implementation phase, negotiating a new trading partnership between the EU and the UK that means we never have to invoke it. And we both agree that it should be temporary. That if it does have to be invoked, it should only apply unless and until we have a new agreement in place. But thirdly, though, we all recognise that it can't be time limited in the sense that it can't have an expiry date. It only comes into force if we don't have an agreement to supersede it, and it only ceases to be enforced when we do have an agreement to supersede it. And that's why it is intended to be temporary, but can't be time limited in the sense of having an expiry date. I know it's terribly complicated, but it makes an awful lot of sense when you think it through.
It's Gabrielle. Also a question about the backstop, please. Is there any chance, under any circumstances, that 27 would consider making the backstop UK-wide, as was requested by London? Is that something you discussed last night with your other colleagues? And also, according to your knowledge, is Barnier thinking about it? Is he considering it? Is he ready to commit to working on possibly making the backstop UK-wide?
Well, I think there would be huge difficulties with that for the European Union. Bear in mind the European Union is willing to make exceptions to treat Northern Ireland as a special case because it is a small place with a population of less than 2 million people, because of the fact that it has a difficult history and a unique geography. It will have a land border with the European Union. It does not have a land border with the United Kingdom. So allowances can be made by the European Union for Northern Ireland. Where the difficulty arises in terms of any sort of UK-wide backstop on customs is, first of all, there's a strong view that that should form part of the future relationship. If that is something that the United Kingdom actually wants, then it should form part of the future relationship rather than a backstop which is supposed to be about Ireland and Northern Ireland. And then secondly, there's the whole issue, and I would feel very strongly about this as well, speaking as a European as well as an Irishman. We couldn't have a situation whereby the United Kingdom had access to the single market, which is our market, and at the same time was able to undercut us in terms of standards, whether it was environmental standards, health, labour laws, state aid, competition. And I don't think any country or any union would be asked to accept that.
Can you tell us, according to your knowledge, is Barnier looking at it or not? Is he analysing it? Is he playing with this idea or not?
You know, I can't speak for Barnier, but what I would say is that we need to listen to any suggestions and any proposals that the UK brings forward. And I think that's just common courtesy, and I think it's just respectful. So any proposals that they bring forward, I think, have to be examined. But the test that Barnier applies in relation to the backstop for Ireland and Northern Ireland are three. It has to work, has to be legally operative in terms of ensuring that we avoid a border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. It has to protect the integrity of the single market and the customs union. And third, it has to apply unless and until we have a new relationship that supersedes it.
Tony Conley from RT.
Taoiseach, the Downing Street was briefing this morning that the original Northern Ireland specific backstop is still unacceptable to the UK. Notwithstanding some of the progress that has been talked about, is that now not going to fundamentally be a problem in this process over the next couple of weeks?
Well, it is a problem, and it has been a problem since March. So that continues. There are two areas about which we do not have agreement. One is the backstop, the other is the future relationship. And what we have to do over the next couple of weeks is to try to come to a compromise that is acceptable on all sides.
Sorry, can you just explain what you mean by the second problem, the future relationship?
Yeah, the future relationship is still not agreed. So what's supposed to be agreed as part of this package, if you like, is the withdrawal agreement with the Irish protocol or backstop, and a joint political declaration on what the future relationship is going to look like, and that will set out the parameters for the new treaty, or the new treaties that will be negotiated between the EU and the UK during the transition period or implementation phase. So what's not yet agreed is the backstop on Ireland and Northern Ireland, and what's not yet agreed is the future relationship, which is the parameters within which we will try to negotiate a new economic and security partnership between the European Union and the UK. So there's a bit to go yet, but I think in describing that, in many ways, it does describe how difficult Brexit is for all of us. A former minister said to me, I think it was a day or two after the referendum, he said to me, some people see Brexit as a storm, you know, a passing squall that will be very rough and will then pass. But it's not. It's what Brexit is it's the political equivalent of climate change. It's a permanent change, not in the weather, but the climate, when it comes to relations between Ireland and the UK and the UK and the EU. So even after we get through this phase, which is the withdrawal agreement, the Irish protocol, and the joint political declaration on the future relationship, we will then have to get into the next set of talks, which is around at least two new treaties, a UK-EU security treaty and a UK-EU economic treaty, if not more. And they will have to be negotiated, and because there'll be mixed agreements, they'll have to be ratified by all member state parliaments. So if anyone is a Brexit correspondent, there will be plenty of work for you for a couple of years ahead.
Sharon Murray, followed by Andrew Brown, followed by James Law.
Taoiseach, Simon Coveney said during the week that the EU could be sympathetic to this idea of UK-wide backstop, but that there wouldn't be time to agree it because of the reasons you mentioned, because of the issues about access to the single market and unfair advantage. But there is an idea that you could have a new backstop negotiated parallel to the future relationship that could possibly replace the old backstop. It could be UK-wide, and the idea would be that it's more palatable to people like the DUP. So is that a possibility that, you know, down the line it could be a UK-wide backstop? Not now, because now we have the Northern Ireland one, we signed up for the withdrawal agreement.
There's lots of ideas floating around and lots of mechanisms, and one of the ones that sort of came out of the ether in the last couple of days was the potential of an extension in the transition period, if that had to be done too. So, you know, suffice to say there are lots of ideas and mechanisms floating around. It wouldn't be in the interest of getting to a deal for me to be speculating about them too publicly.
Yeah, but is it sort of in the ether? Is that something that, you know, because the UK, we know the DUP is so opposed to this Northern Ireland backstop because it sets apart Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. So this could be a solution that keeps the UK together. And as you said, may not be required in the future anyway if the transitional period is extended.
like I said, I'd prefer not to speculate on any of those things, because there are a lot of different ideas floating around and a lot of different mechanisms, and I wouldn't like to give any of them more prominence than they deserve.
Andrew Brown?
Taoiseach, it sounds from your description that we haven't really made much progress on the core issues since June, and now we don't have a summit so far in November. Do you think it's more likely now, after this week, that it may not be until January that there is a final deal? And then secondly, on the question you said that the economic agreement being negotiated alongside the security agreement, what's your best estimate as to how long an agreement of that kind would take to negotiate? Is it 3 years? Is it 5 years?
It's anyone's guess. It's taken 7 years to agree CETA, which was the agreement with Canada, and we haven't yet come to an agreement with South American countries under Mercosur. So these things can take a very long time. Now, the counter argument that I hear when timelines like 7 years are suggested is that it'll be much easier to do this, because the starting point is different. And the starting point between the EU and the UK is that all rules and regulations and everything are already aligned. So therefore, it wouldn't take as long to negotiate as an agreement with Canada or South American countries, where those things are not the case. But I'm sure with goodwill and luck and best efforts and the right politics, I'm sure it could be done in less than 2 years. But I need the assurance that if it can't be done within 2 years, and bear in mind it's not just agreeing it, it's the ratification by 28 member state parliaments, and you'll recall that the regional parliament in Wallonia held up the CETA agreement for a period. So even after it's agreed, there's the ratification issue, and the politics in any one member state or the politics in the UK could make it difficult to ratify those agreements. And that is why it's so important that we have a backstop that is legally operative, so that we know that if things go wrong during the transition period, during the implementation phase, if something goes wrong, that in all circumstances there will not be a hard border.
And then January, the likely month for a deal?
I don't know. I've always said that October is the deadline. I know there are suggestions that it could have been done earlier. I've always said that October is the deadline. Looks like we're going to miss that deadline now. There is another summit in December. I really hope we can have it done in November. If we don't, then we'll do it in December. And if that doesn't happen, then of course that there's other events after that. But to be honest, I just don't know. But I really think it is in everyone's interest that we come to an agreement as soon as possible. Politicians may be able to make late night, last night decisions in rooms in the new year or in December, but businesses are going to make plans long before that. The business sector operates on a quarter by quarter basis. Businesses, banks, employers, airlines will start making decisions, and they will start making decisions that bite, particularly in the United Kingdom, but also in Ireland and other places. And I think it's in the interests of all of our citizens that the politicians and officials get on with this and get it done as soon as possible.
James Rowan, followed by John Powell.
Taoiseach, you met with the DUP earlier in the week. Did you get any sense from them that there's any room to manoeuvre in terms of their red lines of customs checks or any kind of checks in the Irish Sea? And do you think that there's a possibility that they follow through on their threats to bring down Theresa May's government if they don't like the deal that they get?
Well, I think we should always bear in mind that this is a negotiation between the EU, including the Irish government on the one hand, and the UK government on the other. It's not an agreement that's being negotiated by political parties. Obviously, there's a political context in that the DUP requires the votes needed to keep the UK government in office, and there's a political context in the fact that there are divisions within the main party, the main governing party, the Conservative Party as well. But ultimately, this is a negotiation between the EU on the one hand, including Ireland, and the UK on the other. So in terms of my meeting with the DUP, it really was just a chance to exchange views and listen, and to hear what Arlene Foster had to say. Was about lots of other things as well, aside from Brexit. But I certainly understand where they're coming from. I understand their position, which is that they don't want there to be any differences between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. I suppose where I'm coming from is a slightly different position, in that we have a Good Friday Agreement. And if you think about the Good Friday Agreement, there are three basic philosophical principles behind the Good Friday Agreement. You know, first, that we should only pursue political objectives by peaceful means in Britain and Ireland. Second, that Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and nobody is saying otherwise. That can only be changed if a majority of people in Northern Ireland vote for a change in the constitutional status. And thirdly, that there are special arrangements for Northern Ireland. It is the only part of the United Kingdom where there is compulsory parish sharing. It's the only part of the United Kingdom where people have the right to dual citizenship. And it's the only part of the United Kingdom where there's a provision to allow the people there to join a different country should they choose to do so. And at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement is peace, consent and recognition that Northern Ireland is different.
John
Taoiseach, how will Ireland help protect the integrity of the EU single market in the event of a no-deal Brexit?
Yeah, that's obviously a hypothetical question. So and it would be very difficult. So it's not something we're contemplating. We're working might and main in every hour that we have to make sure that we get a deal.
John Downing.
Taoiseach, you mentioned lots of different ideas floating around. Is one of those ideas floating around the prospect of extending the time frame for negotiating Article 50? We know it would require unanimity, but does it have the status of an idea floating around in these parts at the moment? Does it have any status? Secondly, just very briefly, the presidential candidate, Peter Casey, caused a lot of controversy with comments about travellers. Do you have any views on the views he has expressed?
Yeah, on the first question, that particular idea isn't floating around at the moment. I had heard it floating around a few months ago. I'm not sure whether an idea floating around has any status whatsoever, but it is legally possible for Article 50 to be extended if we're unable to come to a deal. But I think that's something that the UK would have to ask for, and they haven't as yet. So that doesn't really arise as a question for us as a European Union unless the UK were to ask for it. But that option is open to the UK if a deal cannot be negotiated in time. In relation to the comments made by Peter Casey, the presidential candidate, all I can say is that I think that his remarks were very divisive, and I think they were largely designed to get attention for him and his campaign, and I think that's really regrettable. And I hope that when the people of Ireland go out to vote next Friday, they will give Mr Casey and anyone who holds those kind of views a very clear message.
We've just time for one final question from Taoiseach or Ceannaigh from the examiner.
Sure. Taoiseach, just a quick clarification just on John's question there on the idea that March 29th extension might be floating around a bit. I know the UK, as you already said, needs to request this, needs to ask it yourself, but would you personally be open to the idea of March 29th extension being extended?
Yeah, you know, it's actually not something that's floating around at the moment. It was floating around a few months ago. It very much would be for the United Kingdom to request an extension if they want one. I wouldn't like to go beyond that because it might be misinterpreted not by you but by media in another country as me calling for it, which I'm not calling for it. I'm calling for a deal to be done.
Okay, thank you very much everyone. Thanks for